Hi everyone, welcome back to Tax Tutoring and Training. My name's Hannah, and today's lesson is on the basics of filing. And as always, there will be guided notes linked down in the description below, which also includes assignments, practice problems. I highly recommend you do them. They're pulled straight from the IRS, and they'll help you prepare for your certification to become IRS Tax Preparer Certified. And they're a great way to stay engaged with the content that's albeit a little taxing. So, with that, let's get started. So, when you're a VITA intern, the most beginning step when dealing with a client is that you're going to interview and intake them, meaning that you use a form provided by the IRS or your site coordinator. You can get it online. Um, and that's going to basically be your interview guide on asking them questions to determine their age, their filing status, their income, that sort of thing. So, those are the first steps that you need in order to first determine if the person can actually prepare a tax return. Is that you need to know their age, you need to know their gross income, and you need to know their filing status. And if you know those things, you can use the decision tree provided in the volunteer resource guide. Remember, the volunteer resource guide, it's basically the IRS's like mini on the go handbook for if you have questions when filing a return, you need like a quick answer, a way to find that answer. The volunteer resource guide is the way to go. So, when you're first interviewing a client and they come in wanting to prepare a tax return, you first have to see if they even have to file a tax return in the first place. And this is found by looking at the date of birth on the interview and income sheet, interview and intake sheet to determine age, and looking at any W-2s, 1099 forms, or any additional income reported that they bring with them, any forms that report that, in order to determine gross income. You also need to know their filing status. And we talked about this a little bit in the last lesson. So if you haven't looked at that, be sure to check it out. I go way into depth on how to determine filing status. So hopefully that'll clarify that concept. But you need, in order to determine if the client even must file a tax return, you have to know their filing status. If they're married, if they want to file jointly or separately, if the taxpayer can be claimed as a dependent, which we went over in a previous lesson on dependents, or if they have any potential dependents of their own. After you determine this information, you then look at these charts. So I've provided them here on the slideshow, and they're also in the notes guide down below. So click on it, download it, fill it out as we're going through the slideshow, and have this chart ready when you're dealing with a client so you can determine if they even have to file it, if they even have to file a return, if you can actually help them. So you go through these trees, you determine their filing status, you look at their age, and you look at their income, and then it'll tell you if you have to file a gross uh, income tax return or not. Here's the rest of the chart. Okay, so after you've determined who has to file, then you should determine if they even should file. Some taxpayers are not required to file, but they should file if they qualify for any credits or refunds. Refunds are basically if you withheld more tax than you actually have to pay to the government at the end of the year and need to claim some of that back. And credits are if you qualify for certain standards, such as if you have a qualifying child, you can claim the child tax credit. And that's just like extra money in your bank that you can get if you file a tax return. But you have to file a tax return to get these. So, a taxpayer who doesn't necessarily have to file should file if they can claim a refund of withheld taxes, earned income credit, additional child tax credit, premium tax credit, American Opportunity Credit, or any other refundable credits. So, how do you know if they can even qualify for these credits? Well, four big indicators if they can qualify for these credits is one, if federal or state income tax was withheld on any income form. Two is if the taxpayer had earned income, because that can qualify for the earned income credit. Three is if a taxpayer had a qualifying child. Like I mentioned before, if you might qualify for the qualifying child tax credit if you have a qualifying child. And number 4 is if the taxpayer or dependent paid higher education expenses, because then you can qualify for the education expense credit. Some special situations occur where automatically the taxpayer must file an income tax return, even if it doesn't look like they would have to based on the decision tree alone. But if they're self-employed with net earnings of $400 or more, then they have to file an income tax return. If they owe special taxes, they also have to file an income tax return. And any taxpayer who received an advance payment of a premium tax credit must also file an income tax return. So, after we determine if the taxpayer even should file a return, if you as an intern should help them file a return, then the next step is to verify their identity. So to file the return, you need to verify the identity of the taxpayer to make sure that they are who they say they are and they're filling out the correct tax return for who they say they are. And in order to do this, you need some documents. You need at least one of these documents to verify identity. This includes a driver's license, a visa, a state ID, a military ID, passport, national ID, employer ID, or school ID. School ID is sometimes not the best at verifying identity and can be up to site coordinator discretion if they present with a school ID. Driver's license, visa, state ID, military ID, or passport are the preferred ones, but any of the subjective ones are mostly up to your site coordinator's discretion. So, after they've given you proof of identity and you can prove that they are who they say they are, then the taxpayer also must have to provide proof of a taxpayer identification number, TIN for short. And they have to provide one for all people listed on their tax return. So if the taxpayer comes in and, for example, has a daughter that they want to claim, they must have the daughter's taxpayer identification number in order to claim them. So, what is a taxpayer identification number? For most people, that's going to be their social security number. And this is the number you get when you're born. When you are established as a U.S. citizen, you get a social security number. That's going to be the primary form of TIN. The second form of TIN that may also be used is an individual taxpayer identification number. This is something that most people get if they lose their social security number, but with the individual taxpayer identification number, it must be used at least once in the last 3 years. So if a client comes in and has an ITIN that was used in 2018 and she's filing a tax return for 2023 and hasn't used say she lost her social security number in 2018, applied for an ITIN, got the ITIN, and used it in 2018 for the 2018 tax return. Then in 2020, then she found it and for the tax return of 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2022. So she used her social security as her TIN for those years. She cannot, and as of the 2023 tax return date, she can't use her ITIN because it wasn't used in the last 3 years. She can only use her social security number or apply for another ITIN if she loses the social security number again or something. The third form of TIN that needs to be presented or could be presented is the Adoption Taxpayer Identification Number, or ATIN. And this is for taxpayers in the process of adopting a child, and this allows them to claim them as a dependent. So, a spouse who is married filing separately. So this means that they are married, but they are not filing jointly. If a spouse wants to file separately, married filing separately, then you cannot do an e-file, meaning you can't do it on a platform such as TaxSlayer, the one that the IRS prefers. You can't do a TaxSlayer return file if they don't have their spouse's social security number. So say a taxpayer comes in, his name's Tommy, he's married to Billy, but they are married filing separately. Tommy cannot e-file unless he has Billy's social security number. but they can do a paper return, and that's up to the site if they offer paper returns or not. My site, the West CTA VITA site, only does e-filing, so we have to have both spouses' social security numbers. Okay, so one of the last things that I'm going to cover is Form 1040 and schedules. So Form 1040 is the primary form used by taxpayers to file an annual income tax return. This is what we as the VITA intern are going to be preparing when we prepare a tax return. It lists all income, all deductions, all credits, everything, all the information of a taxpayer, and that is what's going to be submitted to the IRS to file. Now, in Form 1040, there are certain schedules, and schedules is where additional information is sectionalized. It's basically like extra paper attached to the 1040 if you had any of these extra things. For example, Schedule 1 has additional income and adjustments to income. Schedule 2 has additional taxes. Schedule 3 has additional credits and payments. TaxSlayer is the main electronic software that VITA interns use to e-file returns. And that is where most of this information will be able to be compartmentalized, and a Form 1040 will be able to be generated with the appropriate schedules. So, some things to keep in mind as you file. Publication 17 is a document that contains the answers to many general non-tax questions that the taxpayer might have. Say they have questions about the election campaign fund, which is a question that comes up because it's a box you can check on the interview and intake form. These questions will be answered in Publication 17, which you can direct taxpayers to if they have any additional questions. As we've covered in the ethics lesson, we also need to make sure that we're treating all information used to prepare an individual's tax return as confidential. These taxpayers are entrusting us with their information, their very personal information that could be harmful if it got out. So we need to be professional, and we need to treat it as the confidential information that it is. Sometimes it comes up where there is suspected fraudulent or unusual activity. In this case, notify your site coordinator. Make sure you're being transparent with your superiors, and they can help handle the problem. One last thing to cover before we end our session today is how to file taxpayer identity if the social security numbers or the taxpayer identification numbers don't match up with any of the other statements given by the taxpayer. Sometimes it happens where a taxpayer will come in and their W-2, which indicates wages and taxes withheld on wages, has a different social security number than what is correct. In this case, you can still prepare the return as a intern. You can prepare it, but make sure you put the social security, even though the social security number is wrong or the taxpayer identification number is wrong, you need to put it exactly as it states in the W-2. So the W-2 or the income worksheet that they bring stating their income matches the social security. So you can file it like this, but you can't submit it to the IRS. You can file it, can't submit it until they request another W-2, an updated one with the correct social security number or taxpayer identification number. But you can prepare it, you just can't submit it. With that, that is the basics of filing, and I hope you guys learned something today. And in our next video, we'll be covering unique filing situations, what to do if there's some interesting problems or interesting circumstances. And that way you'll be equipped to handle anything that the clients throw at you. So thanks for listening. Have a great day. Bye.